Week 1 of the 2025 fantasy football season is here, and we can't forget about the quarterback and tight end position as we move in to Week 1. So you know exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, every single player at quarterback and tight end, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. Let's start with Thursday night NFL kickoff. We're going to have the Cowboys traveling to face the Eagles. I think this is going to be a good matchup overall for both the quarterback and tight end position. Let's start with the Cowboys side of things. A little bit of a tough matchup, all in all, for Dak Prescott still, as the Eagles allowed the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last year. We know that, this is a good Eagles defense, top to bottom, right? But this is going to be a different look for the Cowboys headed into 2025, a pass-first offense, and they're actually going to be able to throw the football with a healthy Dak Prescott this season. I think, as a late-round quarterback in draft season, Dak Prescott still had a tremendous amount of value, a new weapon, and George Pickens added to this passing attack. CeeDee Lamb is healthy. Jake Ferguson is healthy and going to be out there. And we know that this running back room is awful for the Cowboys. So I'm all in on Dak Prescott as a weekly start. Maybe the ceiling's a little bit lower here in Week 1 due to the matchup. But if you own Dak Prescott, he was your late-round quarterback, go ahead and fire him up. I'm good with starting him in Week 1. And once again, it's a tough matchup on paper for Jake Ferguson. The Eagles did allow the fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends last year. But I still think that Jake Ferguson's in the startable category, kind of that area. I don't mind if you have to roll with him because you went late round tight end. I don't think the ceiling's tremendously high, and he's probably going to be touchdown dependent. But once again, I do think that he will be pretty heavily involved in this passing attack for the Cowboys and give you at least a respectable stat line at worse. Obviously, if he finds the end zone, then I think he'll be pretty happy with a good double-digit stat line there. But Ferguson, not my favorite, but definitely still startable here in Week 1. Then looking at the Eagles, this is a smash spot for Jalen Hurts. If Jalen Hurts is your starting quarterback going into Week 1, you already probably felt pretty good, but you should feel absolutely ecstatic. He is the definition of a must-start quarterback in Week 1, as the Cowboys allowed the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last season, and they just let Micah Parsons go to the Packers, right? So Jalen Hurts, I think, is basically a lock for probably a rushing touchdown and a solid stat line overall. And I think that the defending Super Bowl champs, Eagles, are going to come out here and just have a big offensive day and showcase why they are still going to be one of the best teams in the league in 2025. So all in on Jalen Hurts. Let's be real. If you had Jalen Hurts, you're already all in on starting him this week anyways. But I will say, if Dallas Goedert is kind of the late round tight end that you had to roll with, the one thing that the Cowboys were good at last year was stopping the tight end position. They allowed the second fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends in last fantasy season. So I don't think it's a great spot for Dallas Goedert. And Dallas Goedert is also a player who I'm not incredibly ecstatic about going into the season. He had some moments last year when there were injuries to A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, but ultimately he was not that great in fantasy last year. So I do think that he'll have moments again this year, but I don't know really what his true fantasy value is going to be in 2025. So he's kind of in the category. I do think he is startable here in Week 1, but ultimately, if you have better options, and you should in Week 1, I would go with them over Dallas Goedert. Next up on Friday night, we are going to have the Chiefs traveling to face the Chargers. And let's start with the Chiefs side of things. Listen, if you own Patrick Mahomes, this was still a quarterback that you had to spend relatively high draft capital on. And, I know there's a lot of knocks against Patrick Mahomes throughout the course of last year and even the previous fantasy season, but he's still been a top 11 fantasy quarterback in the past 2 years. Obviously, much regression there from being a top 4 in the previous 3 seasons. But if you own Mahomes, I think you still got to roll with him and feel pretty good at the end of the day. The Chargers, while they do have a good defense, they still allow the 24th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last season. So I would feel good about Mahomes. We should get better offensive line play out of the Chiefs this year. Is Xavier Worthy going to be out there and healthy? It appears that Hollywood Brown should be out there and healthy Week 1. We'll find out. And, Travis Kelce, Noah Gray, the run game's going to be better this year, so I'm still okay with Mahomes as a solid start here in Week 1. And speaking of Travis Kelce, once again, a lot of knocks here, regression, all that, but he was still the tight end 5 last year, as bad as it felt. Still had 133 targets in this offense, 97 catches, 823 receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns. So Kelce gets a little bit of a steeper matchup, as the Chargers have allowed did allow the 10th fewest fantasy points to tight ends last year. But if you own Kelce, I mean, same thing with Mahomes, right? You went out and drafted these guys to be your starting quarterback and or tight end. So if you own Kelce, I think he is once again a solid start here in week 1. And Noah Gray, not going to be startable for me, but a player worth keeping an eye on. He did have some streamable moments last year and some kind of spurts of games where he did find the end zone, but for now he does not need to be rostered in most formats. Then moving along to the Chargers, Justin Herbert is always a confusing call for me. This was the quarterback 12 last year in fantasy, and it's really kind of hard to call when Herbert's going to have like those upside weeks and kind of the weeks where he's playing at a lower ceiling. But I do think he'll be solid this year. I just have him in the streaming category for week 1 because I do think that the Chargers are going to come out here, play defense first and foremost as much as they can against this Chiefs offense, and run the football before they try and throw the football, especially with the loss of Rashawn Slater at left tackle. So I do like Herbert this week, especially if you're in like a super flex format. Feel good about Herbert as your QB2. But ultimately, I think for most of you guys, you probably don't need to start Justin Herbert. He was a quarterback who kind of fell into the late round range area, and this is a good matchup against the Chiefs. If you look at last year, once again, this is a good defense. They allowed the 21st most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last year. So Herbert, perfectly fine, but I just don't think a lot of you guys are going to have to go out there and have Herbert as your starting QB in week 1. And then we look to Will Dissly and Tyler Conklin at the tight end position. On paper, it's a great matchup for them. The Chiefs allowed the 26th most fantasy points to tight ends last year, but I mean, let's be real. Even in deeper formats, you're not going to feel confident starting either one of these two tight ends. Will Dissly had streamable moments last season, but now Tyler Conklin added to this roster. How does that impact things? Only time will tell, so let's stay away from both Chargers tight ends in week 1. Moving into Sunday's action, we're going to have the Dolphins traveling to face the Colts, and let's just go ahead and start with the Dolphins side of things. Not the greatest matchup on paper. The Colts allowed the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last year, but I don't really fear this Colts defense in week 1 at the same time. So, I know there's been kind of a big knock against Tua in draft season, and is probably undrafted in most of your guys' leagues, but I think he is streamable because I do believe in this Dolphins offense being good enough against the Colts defense in week 1. More of a super flex play here as a second quarterback if you don't have better options. Don't be going out of your way to stream Tua Tagovailoa in week 1, but I think he's a solid start. Could get you somewhere between 16 and 20 fantasy points at best. So I'm okay with Tua as a low-end streaming option, desperation stream, and or a second quarterback in a super flex format. Darren Waller at the tight end position. I mean, I don't think he needs to be rostered right now. We're going to have to see this come to life before we try and, bring any light to it. But I will say it's a great matchup in week 1. The Colts allowed the 30th most fantasy points to tight ends last year. So maybe keep a close eye on Darren Waller. But once again, what kind of situation are you in that you need to consider Darren Waller as your starting tight end in week 1? I don't think that most of you guys need to. But due to the matchup, keep a close eye on him. But then, next week they get New England. Is it going to look the same? Yeah. Following week they get Buffalo. I just don't know. So keep a close eye, but we'll leave it at that for now. Then we got Danny Dimes and company for the Colts. I think Daniel Jones is going to be a straight up sit for me. The Dolphins allowed the fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last year, but I mean, I'll say this in each and every start set video. It's for week 1. It is okay to look at last week's numbers and rankings, definitely to try and help us get somewhat of an idea, but obviously a lot has changed throughout the course of the offseason in terms of defensive rosters. And yeah, I don't fear this Dolphins defense going into this week really whatsoever, but even in deep superflex formats, I will not have the confidence to start Daniel Jones in week 1, but maybe he puts up an okay stat line. We'll find out tougher matchup next week against Denver, even if he does. But Tyler Warren, I will go ahead and just call a start here in week 1. I still believe he's going to be a true security blanket for Daniel Jones. And this is a better matchup as the Dolphins allowed the 19th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends last year. And I think if you drafted Tyler Warren, maybe you drafted another kind of late round tight end like a Dalton Kincaid or Jonnu Smith or I don't know, Tucker Kraft or someone like that, right? And maybe you're going to sit back and see, but for the most part, you still probably spent pretty good draft capital on Tyler Warren and plan on playing him in his rookie season. So I'm okay starting Tyler Warren, and I do think he's going to be one of the most involved players in the Colts passing game, whatever we make of that with Daniel Jones at quarterback. So Warren, I think, is very startable as we approach week 1. Along, we're going to have the Steelers traveling to face the Jets, and I have talked about this matchup in each and every video so far and told you guys that I'm not a big fan of this matchup from a fantasy perspective. So I do have Aaron Rodgers as a sit moving into this matchup. I don't necessarily fear this Jets defense. They allowed the 18th most fantasy points to quarterbacks last year. I mean, the Steelers are on the road here. They're a run-first system under Arthur Smith. Once again, even in like super flex, what type of situation are you in that you need to start Aaron Rodgers in week 1? I just don't think you guys need to, so he's going to be a sit. I do think that Jonnu Smith is startable as a streaming option. I mean, he really fell back in draft rankings, and like even after the trade from the Dolphins, I was still kind of surprised. I think Jonnu Smith has some value in this system, and the Jets are kind of right there in the middle, at least looking at last year's numbers, allowing the 15th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So I mean, I think Jonnu Smith is streamable if you kind of fell into a hole at the tight end position at the end of your draft, waiting at, the position, and you're in that kind of streaming category for the first couple of weeks of the season. I think Jonnu Smith is okay as a start this week, but I would not be going out of your way to start him necessarily. Pat Freiermuth is going to be really interesting to see like the split, for lack of a better word, between these two tight ends in this Arthur Smith system. We know that he likes to utilize the tight end position. We're not that far removed from a couple of seasons ago when Kyle Pitts and Jonnu Smith both had consistent moments with the Falcons under Arthur Smith. So, Freiermuth was a tight end 9 last year, and I don't really think that you guys need to be starting him or going out of your way to starting him, but he could have a role here. Only time will tell, and I don't know. Do I really trust an Arthur Smith system at the end of the day? Probably not. So let's just leave Freiermuth as a sit in week 1. But I do think Jonnu Smith could have some sneaky value. Then we look to the Jets. What are we going to make out of my guy, Justin Fields, here in week 1? Well, it's a stiff matchup. The Steelers, we know this defense is good. They allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last year. And ultimately, I have been a fan of Justin Fields for the rushing upside as a late round quarterback value throughout draft season. But, once again, I've said it throughout the course of the start sit videos. I don't like this matchup for both offenses. I think it's going to be a defensive game at the end of the day. And the sample size out of Justin Fields in the preseason was completely mixed. We saw that first game where he was able to come out, run the football, score a touchdown, basically give us confidence. And that last game against the Giants is like, can Justin Fields even put together a drive? And that's basically in a shell what Justin Fields is, right? So here in week 1, I'm still going to say he's streamable, but I think for a lot of you guys, if you own Justin Fields, you probably have another late round quarterback on your roster, like a Dak Prescott or Caleb Williams, maybe like a Brock Purdy, CJ Stroud, somebody like that. And I would just sit Justin Fields for majority of you guys this week because the matchup is bad. But if you're in a bind, you can throw a dart here. I think he's streamable just because he has that rushing upside, but I would still try to avoid this matchup if possible. I do think rookie tight end Mason Taylor is definitely worth keeping an eye on. And if you're kind of weak at the tight end position, like maybe Jonnu Smith is your only tight end, keep a close eye on Mason Taylor, sitting at 22% roster at the time I record this. Listen, I don't really like him in this matchup against the Steelers because I don't like anybody in this matchup. Sorry, I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but the Steelers allowed the 18th most fantasy points to tight ends last year, and Mason Taylor could really turn into the number 2 or number 3 receiving option in this Jets offense behind Garrett Wilson and I guess Breece Hall, right? So I do like the potential of Mason Taylor, but once again, what format are you guys in that you need to start Mason Taylor in week 1? For a majority of you guys, he's just going to be a sit as we approach the week. Next up, we will have the Panthers traveling to face the Jaguars. And let's start with Bryce Young and company in his third season, now under head coach Dave Canales, which he was with last year. But it almost feels like a different season under Dave Canales, because we saw what Dave Canales could lead Bryce Young into at the end of last year. And I think that is a good matchup in week 1 for Bryce Young. So I have got him as a low-end desperation streaming option because the Jaguars allowed the 25th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last year. And I think ultimately he can just be a good streaming option. I've talked about the Panthers offense throughout the course of this week, and I basically like everybody. Now, I think it does hurt that Jalen Coker is now headed to IR after hurting his quad in practice. I was, in on the cokehead hype, right? But there's still good enough running backs between Chuba and Rico Dowdle on this team. We still have T-Mac, the potential upside of Xavier Legette, and I don't know. I guess Hunter Renfrow. So, I think it hurts a bit ultimately, but I think that the matchup is good enough. Low-end streaming option, super flex type option, but let's not get crazy here. Let's sit back and see if Bryce Young can string together a couple of solid games early in the season. Now, Ja'Tavion Sanders kind of falls into that range of like players who could be something. If you're streaming at the tight end position, a player to keep a close eye on, but ultimately, I think it's just going to be a sit. I just don't see what situation you're in that you would need to start him in week 1. But it is a good matchup. The Jags were very poor against tight ends last year, allowing the 24th most fantasy points to the position. So Sanders, worth keeping an eye on, especially with the Jalen Coker injury and Adam Thielen traded. So maybe, he is the type of tight end who can line up and catch passes. Maybe he gets some involvement. He did have some moments last year, especially before he had that neck injury. So keep a close eye on, but yeah, we're not starting him in week 1. Then we move to the Jags with new head coach Liam Cohen coming over from the Buccaneers. Trevor Lawrence, man, been a rough 2 years if you have been a T-Law truther, but I think that Trevor Lawrence will kind of live in that streamable category, probably be a quarterback due to matchups, can give you a good floor, and this is a good matchup. Panthers very bad against quarterbacks last year, allowing the 29th most fantasy points to the position. So they're at home. We got Travis Hunter added. We got a run game with 3 running backs that can, do some sort of damage. We still got B-Tom at the quarterback position. Some other names like Dewami Brown. We got Brenton Strange at tight end. I think that the Jaguars can string something together, and then Trevor Lawrence can have a respectable stat line in week 1. So especially in Superflex, good enough option, and ultimately a streamable option if you are in a hole at the quarterback position for some reason in single quarterback leagues in week 1. And speaking of Brenton Strange, I think Brenton Strange is streamable. Once again, this is just a good matchup across the board for all positions when we look at this game. And the Panthers allowed the 27th most fantasy points to the position last year. And, if you kind of threw a dart at the end of your draft at tight end, once again, you're in a hole. Brenton Strange fits that streaming category. We know that Trevor Lawrence does like to target the tight end position. And I think, Liam Cohen definitely showed that he can utilize the tight end position as he had to with Cade Otton last year when there were injuries to guys like Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. So I do like Brenton Strange, but once again, don't be going out of your way and getting cute here. But he is a streamable tight end if you are in a hole as we approach week 1. Next up, we will have the Cardinals traveling to face the Saints. Tale of 2 different quarterback and tight end rooms here. Let's start with the Cardinals. Listen, Kyler Murray coming off of a season where he was the quarterback 10 in fantasy, and it sure does not feel like that was the case. You either got like an extreme ceiling or an extreme floor with Kyler Murray last year. And it was really difficult to call when, but if you drafted Kyler Murray, I think you're starting him in week 1. It's a good matchup. This is a bad defense. The Saints allowed the 20th most fantasy points of quarterbacks last year. Just not a good defense, head to toe, essentially. So Kyler, I just wouldn't overthink it. I know there's the bad interception in the last preseason game he played in, but he completed every other pass in that game. So listen, I'm okay with Kyler Murray, and I just wouldn't overthink it. If you drafted 2 quarterbacks, then maybe like the other option more. But for a lot of you guys who did draft Kyler, let's just roll with him in week 1. Even though the Cardinals are on the road, this is still a good spot for them in week 1. And then Trey McBride, we don't really need to break down. You're going to start him each and every week, regardless of matchup, if you draft him. For reference, the Saints allowed the 14th most fantasy points to tight ends last year, so they're kind of right there in the middle. But once again, yeah, you drafted Trey McBride. There's nothing to talk about here. He is your starting tight end as long as healthy every single week. Don't overthink it for some strange reason in week 1. And then we look at the Saints, and here there's just really nothing to discuss. Even in super flex formats, deep dynasty formats, whatever it is, 20-man formats, Spencer Rattler does not need to be a start this week. I think that the Cardinals defense is going to have a very good day against this Saints offense, and I would be terrified if Spencer Rattler was in my starting lineup, so I will just leave it at that. And Juwan Johnson, I just don't think is going to be startable here. I know he's had moments over the past few seasons, but I just don't want to have any part of Juwan Johnson in my starting lineup, once again, even in deep formats. So for reference, the Cardinals allowed the 17th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last year, and they were pretty good against tight ends, allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points to the position. But let me know in the comments if for some reason you are in a format where you are considering Spencer Rattler or Juwan Johnson in week 1. I would be curious to know. Next up, we have the Giants traveling to face the Commanders. Let's start with Dangerous himself. No Jameis Winston, no Jackson Dart. We got the Russ Bus as the QB1 here in week 1 for the Giants. But yeah, I just can't with any confidence start Russell Wilson, even in like super flex formats. I mean, maybe he's okay as like a QB3 on your bench to kind of sit back and see what happens. It is a decent enough matchup as the Commanders allow the 19th most fantasy points to the position last year. But once again, I just don't think a majority of you guys are going to be in a situation where you need to start Russell Wilson or consider him. I am a Commanders fan, a longtime Washington fan, and I mean, we do kind of fail when we're expected not to. So, I won't be surprised if the Giants come out and play decently against the Commanders. It's not like we have a loaded defense by any stretch, but ultimately, Russell Wilson's just going to be a sit for me here in week 1. And Theo Johnson, kind of in that same range like Jatavion Sanders. I think he's certainly worth paying attention to. It's a steep matchup. Commanders were good against tight ends last year, allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points to the position. But once again, he just lies in that area of like, let's pay attention. Maybe he can become a streaming option potentially. But yeah, we're not starting Theo Johnson in week 1. Then we move to the Commanders. If you own Jaden Daniels, this is a smash spot, as the Giants allowed the 22nd most fantasy points to the position last year. And if you own Jaden Daniels, as long as he's healthy, you are starting him each and every week, no matter what. Not a lot to discuss here. JD5 is locked and loaded as a starting quarterback in week 1. Zach Ertz, certainly interesting because the Giants were good against opposing tight ends last year. Kind of interesting, all 4 NFC East teams in the top 8 against opposing tight ends last year. The Giants came in 4th overall, and I think that Zach Ertz is still streamable. You know, he's going to be touchdown dependent. I mean, a lot of tight ends are touchdown dependent, but I mean, Ertz was your tight end 7 last year in fantasy, and we look at the makeup of this roster. Like, I know Debo's been added, and we got a lot of hype at the running back position, but Zach Ertz, I still think will be like a security blanket for Jaden Daniels in his sophomore season. So I think he'll be involved enough that, I know he really fell back in draft season, but, and I get it, he's age 34 going into his 13th season and everything, but he's still streamable, just kind of crossing your fingers for a touchdown if Zach Ertz is your starting tight end in week 1. Except we should have a great matchup for fantasy as the Buccaneers travel to face the Falcons, and Baker Moneymaker Mayfield is a starting quarterback every single week, no matter what. And this is a great matchup against the Atlanta Falcons, who allowed the 26th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last year. And I mean, maybe if you're a Baker owner, a little bit worried. We got no Tristan Wirfs week 1 at the tackle position. We got no Chris Godwin. Jalen McMillan's hurt. Rashad White's banged up, But there's going to be enough here between guys like Bucky Irving, Mike Evans, Emeka Egbuka, Cade Otton, even at the tight end position, and even some maybe kind of quiet wide receivers like Sterling Shepard, who had moments last year. And regardless, Baker is a quarterback who's going to find a way to get it done, and it is a great matchup against the Falcons. If we look at last year's matchups between the Bucs and Falcons, if it's any tail, this is going to be a good day for fantasy when it comes to the players involved in this game. So Baker, I mean, if you drafted him, he's already a starting quarterback. You know that, but you should feel very good. A must-start quarterback in week 1. Feeling so confident in Baker Mayfield this week that I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on his passing touchdowns, currently sitting at 1.5 total passing touchdowns. I think he's going to smash against this Falcons defense. And all new users to Underdog who sign up using promo code THECATCH, that link is down below, are going to receive a free NFL Pick'em to use towards week 1's action. Take that free Pick'em, pair it with the over on Baker Mayfield's total passing touchdowns, and you will automatically double your cash entry. And all new users to Underdog who sign up using that promo code THECATCH are also going to receive $50 in bonus credits as soon as they play through $5 on Underdog. So make sure you guys are signing up using promo code THECATCH to take advantage of all of their week 1 NFL exclusive offers. Cade Otton is coming in questionable for week 1. And, I don't really think he's kind of in like that potentially streamable category, especially with no Chris Godwin or McMillan out there. But yeah, once again, we might get into week 1 by the time this video comes out even, and he might not even be an option for you guys. And the Falcons 13th against tight ends last year. Cade Otton, when you really look at last year, I do think he is a good tight end, but a majority of the high ceiling games came when there was no Mike Evans and no Chris Godwin. So I just don't think that he's going to be a consistent fantasy option until we see it on a week-to-week basis. I'm staying away from Cade Otton. Maybe streamable at times, but then also, is he even going to be able to play in week 1? Only time will tell. So let's just stay away from the situation as a whole. And then we move to the Falcons. Definitely interesting when it comes to quarterback and tight end here in week 1 of the 2025 season, but I've kind of stuck throughout the course of the offseason as I think Michael Penix is a streamable quarterback and a quarterback who has some upside at the end of drafts. And I think going into week 1 in a matchup against the Buccaneers, who allowed the 31st most fantasy points to quarterbacks last year, at home for Michael Penix and his kind of sophomore season, almost rookie season still, as he barely played last year. I think he's a good streaming option, good quarterback 2 in Superflex or 2 quarterback leagues, right? I'm not going to say he's anything more than that, but I really like this matchup for him. There's enough weapons around him. I know that the Falcons have kind of quietly had some injuries to their offensive line, but I know Darnell Mooney's banged up too, but I still think that there's enough weapons around him with Bijan, Drake London, and I guess Kyle Pitts at the tight end position too. I think Michael Penix, a low-end streaming option here in week 1 that could have some sneaky upside. And then we looked at Kyle Pitts. Listen, I think he's in the streaming category due to the matchup. The Bucs were awful against tight ends last year as well, allowing the 28th most fantasy points to the position. So I'm going to say Kyle Pitts. I probably wouldn't do it personally, but I think he's a low-end streaming option as well. Once again, I think there's going to be a lot of points in this game. It's a great matchup, and Michael Penix has talked a lot about Kyle Pitts, being an option for him in the offseason and through training camp. So, listen, I know, roll your eyes. Like I said, I'm probably not going to do it personally in any leagues, but I do think that Kyle Pitts, due to the matchup, is streamable in week 1. But along, we got the Bengals traveling to face the Browns. If you own Joe Burrow, there's not a lot to talk about here. He is a must-start quarterback here in week 1. The Browns were good against opposing quarterbacks last year, allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points. And there is sometimes this talk about week 1 Joe Burrow. Last year, 8 fantasy points in week 1 against the Pats. The previous season, week 1, 3 points against Cleveland. Sometimes that discussion comes up. I don't really care. We're starting Joe Burrow no matter what. Both these defenses are bad. There's going to be points in this game. They are on the road. Once again, Are you really going to sit Joe Burrow in week 1 if you drafted him? No, you got to play him, got to start him no matter what. He's a must-start quarterback this week. It's going to be interesting to see, once again, for lack of a better term, the split between Mike Gesicki and potentially Noah Fant and how both these tight ends are utilized. I mean, I'm a little bit higher on Gesicki still because he's more familiar with the team. It's a good matchup. The Browns allowed the 25th most fantasy points to tight ends last year, but once again, I mean, really, what type of position are you in that you need to start Gesicki or Fant in week 1? I'm just staying away from both these guys in week 1. Maybe somebody here could arise as a potential streaming option at times in the season, but I'm going to go ahead and say sit these guys confidently in week 1. Then we look at the Browns. I put Joe Flacco as a sit, and I'm kind of torn on it. I do think I'll go ahead and say I put the asterisk there because in like Superflex, double quarterback, I mean, we see a lot of rosters here on the channel, a lot of different formats. If you are desperate enough, I think that maybe you could start Joe Flacco in a double quarterback super flex league. The Bengals, we know this defense is bad, and they allowed the 27th most fantasy points to quarterbacks last year. There's enough weapons here, Njoku, Judy, Said Tillman, maybe something to get going with the run game. I don't know, with this offensive line, probably not. But once again, the matchup is here, and the Browns are at home. I just don't really know what type of Flacco we're going to get here in week 1. He is age 40 going into year 18. So I'm going to, for the most part, avoid Flacco, but the matchup makes it at least a conversation. But for a majority of guys, let's not consider Flacco in week 1. And don't overreact. Even if he has like a decent game, it's a much tougher stretch after week 1 at Baltimore, Green Bay at home, at Detroit, Minnesota at home, at Pittsburgh. I think the magic could wear out quickly here. But I do like David Njoku quite a bit here in week 1. We have seen in the past a connection between Flacco and Njoku, and I think that Njoku is kind of one of these tight ends that's a bit underrated. He's been a tight end 11 or better in 3 straight seasons, and he only played in 11 games last year and was a tight end 11 last year, right? So I think that David Njoku, if you own him, go ahead and start him. The Bengals were god-awful against tight ends last year, allowing the 31st most fantasy points to the position. If you own Njoku, go ahead and fire him up. I think he's kind of a quiet, very solid start in week 1. Next up, we have the Raiders traveling to face the Patriots. And this is an interesting matchup at both the quarterback and tight end position. Let's start with the Raiders side of things. I have Geno Smith as a sit, and I don't really think I want to find out, even in like a super flex format, in week 1 exactly what Geno Smith is going to be. I mean, I have said it throughout the course of these start sit videos. I'm not worried. Like this Patriots defense doesn't scare me, even though Mike Vrabel is the head coach now. In theory, they're going to be more defensive minded, right? But they were good against opposing quarterbacks last year. I mean, I'll say that, allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points to the position. But I do think that there's going to be moments, the point I'm trying to get to here, throughout the season where Geno Smith can be streamable, especially in, double quarterback super flex leagues. But here in week 1, once again, I just don't see a scenario where you guys are going to need to start him in week 1. So let's avoid him. Now, Brock Bowers, once again, it doesn't matter what the matchup is. It doesn't matter. As long as Brock Bowers is healthy, he is in your starting lineup no matter what. For reference, the Patriots were 12th against opposing tight ends last year. But you own Brock Bowers, don't overthink it. He is your tight end 1 when healthy every single week. Then we move to the Patriots, who I do think are really interesting here because throughout the course of draft season, I mean, there have been a lot of you guys really, really confident in Drake May in his sophomore season, and I think that's completely fine, and it is a great matchup as the Raiders allowed the 30th most fantasy points to the position last year. So if Drake May's your guy, and he might be your QB1, sure, throw them out there. The Patriots are at home, and it is a fantastic matchup. But my concern here is that with Mike Vrabel as a new head coach, they're going to be a run-first offense. That could be good at times for Drake May, a lot of play action type stuff like that. But I think ultimately here in week 1, they're going to try and pound the football quite a bit. We'll find out. I still think Drake May will give you a solid floor due to the matchup alone. So if you own Drake May, I think he's a good start, especially in Superflex, double QB. But ultimately in single quarterback, there's probably better options. It's still my feel for week 1. Then Hunter Henry, I think, has been a player who's been like just kind of quietly overlooked as we move in to the first week of the season. And I do think especially in full PPR, he is startable. The Raiders allowed the 29th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends last year, and this was the tight end 12 last year. Still had 674 receiving yards off of 66 catches, and I mean, just 2 touchdowns. But once again, I think he can give you like 10 to 12 points pretty easily, be a solid floor type play in a great matchup. And I still think when we look at the makeup of this receiving room for the Patriots, Hunter Henry, who had a good chemistry with Drake May last year, is going to continue to be a good kind of security blanket type option for Drake May in his sophomore season. So Hunter Henry is definitely in that streamable category here in week 1. Moving into the afternoon games, let's start with the 49ers traveling to face the Seahawks. And my feel here is that Brock Purdy is still a solid start moving into the week. Once again, a player who I just feel like was a bit undervalued in draft season. It's not an awful matchup, not a great matchup, as the Hawks allowed the 14th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last year, so kind of right there in the middle. The Niners are on the road. There's not a lot of healthy players on this team, but there are stars and great players like Christian McCaffrey and George Kittle fully healthy. And I still think that, Ricky Pearsall is going to be a good wide receiver 1. The time I'm recording this, I don't know what in the world is going on with Jawan Jennings. So the wide receiver 2 on this team might be Sky Moore or Russell Gage, or I don't know. Everybody on this receiver room is either suspended or hurt other than Ricky Pearsall, or they've just been added to the roster in like the last 20 minutes or whatever. So that does kind of concern me, but I think, I'm a long-term Purdy truther, and I still think he's a good enough quarterback where the floor will be solid here, but maybe piece together some of these warning signs and tamper your expectations here in week 1 on the road. But then it gets a little bit better with New Orleans in week 2, Jacksonville in week 4, Arizona in the middle there. So there's still going to be a lot of really good moments, I think, for Purdy this fantasy season. Then George Kittle, I mean, there's no discussion to be had here if you own Kittle. I mean, he's in line for a massive amount of volume because of all of the injuries. So I think if you own Kittle, you're already feeling good no matter what. But this offseason has probably impacted Kittle the most positively out of anybody on this roster, I would argue. And the Hawks were poor against opposing tight ends last year, allowing the 21st most fantasy points to the position. So if you own Kittle, feel good, and I think he's going to have another monster top 5 season in him for sure. Then we move to the Seahawks side of things, and similar to Geno Smith, I do think that there will be moments where Sam Darnold is streamable throughout the course of the off season, and I'm not really worried about this Niners defense. They were decent against quarterbacks last year, 16th most fantasy points to the position, kind of right there in the middle. And I do truly believe there will be times where Darnold's going to be streamable this year, but I don't know. It's also going to be a run-first system under Clint Kubiak as the new OC. They're going to utilize Walker and Charbonnet quite a bit, but I think that there are enough receiving options around Darnold, and he does kind of excel to some degree at the play-action scheme. So I think that he'll have some good moments, but here in week 1, once again, I mean, maybe if you pushed it in like a super flex league, he kind of falls into that same area with Geno Smith where it's kind of gray, but I think for majority of guys out there, Sam Darnold is not going to be your option here in week 1. Then we have kind of a split. Once again, a tight end, Elijah Araro, the rookie, and then A.J. Barner, who was on the team last year, right? No Noah Fant on this team. And we're just kind of going to sit back and see what happens. The Niners were 9th against opposing tight ends last year. They did play good against the tight end position. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to find out in week 1 by any stretch who the Seahawks tight end who has the chance in fantasy is going to be in my starting lineup. So let's just avoid Seahawks tight ends as we approach week 1. Moving along, we will have the Titans traveling to face the Broncos, and rookie Cam Ward in his first NFL start is on the road against the best defense in the NFL. This is not a good spot for Cam Ward, and the Broncos were 12th against opposing quarterbacks last year. They were much better against other positions, but still quite good against opposing quarterbacks. So, I'm not starting Cam Ward, even in like super flex, double QB, dynasty, whatever. If you have shares of him, I'm just going to stay away from Cam Ward in his first NFL start. I don't like seeing, offenses travel to Denver. It's already a hard setting to play in. And then ultimately, it's a tough matchup. And I just don't feel good about this one for Cam Ward. Chicken Conquo could have moments where he's streamable this year, as he does every single year. But still, this is a bad matchup. Good defense. Broncos allowed the 11th fewest fantasy points to tight ends, so I don't think a lot of you guys really needed to consider Cam Ward or Okonkwo in week 1, but I'm staying away from both of them. And for the most part, I'm staying away from this entire Titans offense, except for like Tony Pollard in week 1. But then we look to Bo Nix and company in his sophomore season, and I do like Bo Nix quite a bit in week 1. I know, shocker, as I was a huge Bo Nix fan last year, but I mean, I guess I will go ahead and point out that the Titans were okay against opposing quarterbacks, allowing the 11th fewest fantasy points to the position. And, while the Titans didn't have a good defense necessarily last year, they came in relatively high in some rankings when it came to fantasy points allowed. I mean, for reference, they allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, which we'll talk about in a second. But I just have the feeling at home in week 1, the Broncos are going to come out in large fashion with this offense and have a good offensive day. So Bo Nix, if you draft him, you're probably starting him no matter what anyways, but maybe see the matchup. You can see the color on your, sleeper app or whatever and see the ranking from last year and you're getting a little bit nervous. Maybe even another like late round guy that you went with. I think I would still start Bo Nix, and maybe the ceiling's not incredibly high here in week 1, but I think he should be in your starting lineup. And really the same goes for Evan Ingram. Once again, on paper, not a great matchup for Ingram when it comes to fantasy points allowed. But, Marvin Mims is dealing with that groin injury, and we might get a toss-up between Pat Bryant and Troy Franklin as the wide receiver 2 on Sunday. We'll find out. Maybe by the time this video comes out, you'll know. But I think Evan Ingram behind Courtland Sutton could be in line for a very large day and be the true number 2 pass catcher here. So if you own Evan Ingram, go ahead, feel good. I think that he is a solid start in his first start with the Broncos here in week 1. Next up, we have a good divisional matchup between the Lions and the Packers. And I think a lot of good involvement for fantasy in this game as well. Let's start with the Lions side of things. It's a tough matchup on paper. The Packers allowed the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last year. No more Ben Johnson at OC. You might have some concerns if you drafted Jared Goff, and I did see Goff fall back a bit and when it came to actual draft days in a lot of leagues. And I mean, they're on the road here. I don't know. I just feel like it's a divisional matchup, and this game's either going to be like one of those weird like 16-10 scores or like 35-28 type scores. Like there's not going to be any in between there. So I think Goff is still a good start. Micah Parsons added to this Packers defense. They're kind of lacking in the secondary, at least at the cornerback position. I think Goff is going to be fine in this matchup. There's been some losses at offensive line. Like the Lions are definitely in a weird place when it comes to fantasy, but my gut feeling is just go ahead and start the Lions offensive starters in week 1 for the most part. And that would include Sam Laporta as well in this matchup going up against the Packers, who were pretty poor against tight ends, allowing the 23rd most fantasy points to the position last year. So I just don't want to overthink this one. I think the Lions offense is still going to be fine this year. Maybe they take a knock here and there, but in week 1, I do have a fear of divisional games like always, and this does feel like one of those that could be a trap, but ultimately I'm going to go ahead and start these starters as you guys see on the screen. So Goff, Laporta, I'm good with in week 1. Now, Jordan Love, I do have in the start category, but once again, I do have some slight concerns. It is a good matchup. The Lions allowed the 23rd most fantasy points to the quarterback position last year, but I don't know. Their entire defense was hurt off and on last year as well. So I don't know how much we can really look at last year's rankings. But what I am like more concerned about with Jordan Love here is like, I mean, I don't know who's healthy on this team right now. Like, we could be walking into Sunday with Matthew Golden and Romeo Doubs as the only healthy wide receivers, and then Tucker Kraft at the tight end position, which could lead to a lot of involvement in the run game and Josh Jacobs. But then once again, the Lions, this is a tough run defense. So I just don't know. And at the end of the day, they are at home. I think they will try to establish the run early and often in this game. But yeah, I mean, I think that, Jordan Love would benefit from Jaden Reed being out there as well, which he could be. By the time this video comes out, maybe we'll know. Dontayvon Wicks being out there, which once again, he could be as well. But both those guys dealing with injury. The ghost of Christian Watson's going to be on these sidelines. And I think that's going to mean, Matthew Golden, Romeo Doubs, the primary targets next to Tucker Kraft to the tight end position. So I do kind of worry, Jordan Love had a lot of kind of low ceiling games last year, and it was tough to call when he might have a higher ceiling game. And he only finished above 21 fantasy points twice last year. So, I do have some concerns when it comes to Jordan Love, but here in week one, if he's your starting quarterback and you feel like you got nothing better, I still think that the floor is probably safe enough, but you might be getting closer to like the 16, 17 point range, depending on how this game script shakes out. And then we got Tucker Kraft, who I really do like, for all the reasons that I'm worried about Jordan Love because of all the injuries to the wide receiver position. And yes, when you break down Tucker Kraft's numbers last year, he was touchdown dependent. He only had one double-digit game last year where he did not score a touchdown. But once again, like outside of the top 3 or 4 tight ends every year, we're looking at touchdown dependency, right? So it is a tough matchup. The Lions were good against opposing tight ends last year, allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points to the position. But I think the volume is going to be there for Tucker Kraft. So if you own him, I think he is a good start. Really, from this matchup at quarterback and tight end, I have the most confidence in Tucker Kraft out of any player. We'll see what happens. To wrap up the afternoon slate, we're going to have the Texans traveling to face the Rams, and let's start with the Texans side of things. So CJ Stroud had a sophomore slump, right? QB 11, rookie season, QB 18 last year. This offensive line is still not good. Pass catchers are going to come to Nico Collins, Christian Kirk, Jaden Higgins, Jalen Noel, then Dalton Schultz at tight end. And then who in the world knows what's going on with this running back room? Probably going to be Nick Chubb and Woody Marks, maybe some Dameon Pierce. So I do have some concerns on the road here for CJ Stroud and company. I think he's a lower end startable quarterback, but he is closer to that streaming option because I do like this Rams defensive line a lot. The Rams allowed the 13th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last year, so it's kind of a tough call here, kind of a close call. He was close to the streamable category for me, but I also believe this is going to be a pass-heavy team who could have difficulty leaning on the run, and I believe in Nico Collins, and I believe in my guy Christian Kirk. I think that somebody else can step up as the wide receiver 3, and this has been one of the most pass-heavy teams over the past 2 years. And once again, offensive line, lack of top-tier running back is probably going to lead them to throw the football more. So I think Stroud is startable, but maybe a lower-end start. And Dalton Schultz, another one of these guys, like at times might fall into the streamable category, but I'm just not going to find out in week one. And the Rams, I mean, they were awful against tight ends last year for what it's worth. They gave up the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. But once again, like, what situation are you in that you need to see what Dalton Schultz is going to do in your starting lineup in fantasy in week one? Let's just avoid him altogether. Then at the time I'm recording this, we don't know for sure that Matthew Stafford is going to start in week one as he's been dealing with that back injury, but my feel is that Matthew Stafford will be out there at home here in week one against the Texans. So I'm still going to sit Matthew Stafford. Like, I know Stafford, was a good quarterback last year in terms of like the Rams were able to bring this team together and make the playoffs and win the division and make a push somewhat in the playoffs, but he was not great for fantasy. He had a little bit of a stretch mid-season where he had 4 games with 19 or more fantasy points. But outside of that, he didn't score more than 19 fantasy points in a single game. So, it's not like he was lighting it up last year or really a startable quarterback. We're more looking at the fantasy impact for guys like Puka Nacua and Kyron Williams and Devontae Adams. So Stafford's just going to be a sit for me, pretty plain and simple. And this is a good Texans defense, giving up the 15th most fantasy points to the position, kind of right there in the middle. But still, I'm not going to start Stafford in week one, even in like super flex formats. Tyler Higbee is the starting tight end at the moment. Maybe we see somebody like Terrence Ferguson, the rookie, come in here, make some waves. But once again, what format are you in that you need to consider either of these guys in week one? The Texans 16th against the position last year, but once again, just not a lot of upside here. Let's avoid the quarterback and tight end room for the Texans in week one. Sunday night football, we will have the Ravens traveling to face the Bills, and what's going to be a very exciting game for fantasy and for real-life football. Lamar Action Jackson is technically coming in as questionable as he's been dealing with that foot injury, but he's going to be good to go. He's going to line up. He's going to play. We all know this. And if you own Lamar Jackson, we got nothing to break down, nothing crazy. I can tell you guys, you are starting Lamar Jackson, and we're starting both quarterbacks in this game for sure. The Bills did allow the 8th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks last year, so keep that in mind, I guess. But come on, there's going to be fireworks in this game. It's the first Sunday Night Football game of the year. It's going to be a good competitive game script. And Lamar Jackson was a QB1 last year in fantasy, and you drafted him to be your starting quarterback every single game. You start him no matter what happens as long as he is healthy every game of the year. And when it comes to the tight end position, we know there's going to be no Isaiah Likely in week 1. And that means that Mark Andrews should be in line for a big game. And I still think he's been somewhat undervalued in draft season. I know he kind of moved a bit back up after Likely suffered the injury. But I think if you own Mark Andrews, you should feel good in week 1. The Bills were soft against tight ends last year, allowing the 22nd most fantasy points to the position. And really, I mean, Mark Andrews is arguably the number 2 pass catcher on this team, if at worst the number 3, with really just Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman at wide receiver. And I guess, DeAndre Hopkins as well as there. But yeah, I think Mark Andrews is in line for a good amount of volume, and I like him a lot in week 1. Then, like I said, you're starting Josh Allen in week 1 if you own him. Not a lot to break down here. Quarterback 2 last year in fantasy. Similar to Lamar Jackson, you start him every single week, no matter what, as long as he is healthy, regardless of what happened the previous week. But this is a great spot. I know a lot of people are still talking about this Ravens defense going into week 1 and going into the year as being like, is the Ravens defense, they're a good defense, but I mean, they were pretty awful last year against opposing quarterbacks and wide receivers, and they gave up the 28th most fantasy points to quarterbacks last year. So I would feel good about starting Josh Allen. You already were feeling good, but yeah, he is the definition of a must-start quarterback in week 1. And I do think that Dalton Kincaid is in the streamable category simply just due to lack of true pass-catching options on this Bills roster. The Ravens were good against opposing tight ends last year, for what it's worth, allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points to the position. And I don't want to go out of my way to start Dalton Kincaid, but I do think he'll be one of these tight ends who is a good streaming option with a safe floor, and hopefully we get more out of Kincaid than what we got in his sophomore season, moving from the tight end 11 to the tight end 30 last year. Not exactly an extremely exciting receiving room with, banged up Khalil Shakir, Keon Coleman, Josh Palmer, Curtis Samuel, and Elijah Moore at the time I'm recording this, and I guess Dawson Knox at the tight end 2 is looming around somewhere. And so I think that Kincaid could step into some decent volume here in week 1, but I'm not going to put him above a streaming option as we approach the week. Last but not least, we will have the Vikings traveling to face the Bears. And let's start with sophomore, basically rookie quarterback J.J. McCarthy, who once again throughout the course of draft season has been one of my late round dart throws if you absolutely punted the quarterback position. I think that McCarthy in this Kevin O'Connell system is going to have some good moments, but I don't know if week 1 on the road against the Bears, who allowed the 2nd fewest fantasy points, is going to be a spot where I'm going to try and, see if that happens. Week 2, Atlanta at home. Week 3 against Cincinnati at home. I would feel better about those matchups than, once again, week 1, again on the road against Chicago, who allowed the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the position. So if you own J.J. McCarthy, sit back, see what happens. He should be on your bench. In super flex, double quarterback, I would still try to not start J.J. McCarthy in week 1, especially no Jordan Addison. Maybe a banged up Justin Jefferson. J.J. will be out there, but maybe if you're concerned about that only hurts J.J. And Adam Thielen's going to be there for what that's worth, I suppose. And that, all of that being said, that's probably going to be a good thing for TJ Hawkinson at the tight end position. Coming off a season where he was just never fully healthy from the injury the previous season, Hawkinson's going to be in line for a lot of good volume, and the Bears allowed the 17th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends last year. So, yeah, I think Hawkinson is a good start this week, and if you drafted him, you're probably starting him anyways, but he could certainly be in line for a lot of volume the first 3 weeks of the season. So I would call him a must-start tight end here in week 1. Then we move to the Bears. What are we going to do with Caleb Williams in his first start in his sophomore season at home against what is ultimately still a good Vikings defense? I know they lost some pieces in the offseason, but this is a good system that gets after the quarterback. They allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks last year, but New OC, Ben Johnson, a lot of improvements to the offensive line in the offseason, different room of weapons at wide receiver and tight end for the most part. I think Caleb Williams is still streamable here in week 1. If they're on the road, maybe I'd be more shaky, but I do think a lot of you guys drafted Caleb Williams as like a QB2 with some upside to see what happens. If he's your starting quarterback, I think it's okay, but I think that the floor could be somewhat limited here in week 1. I don't want to put him above a streaming option. Then we have rookie Colston Loveland at the tight end position, which, he was getting reps with the first team in preseason. He was injured for part of preseason, but a lot of potential upside here in a matchup against the Vikings, who allow the 20th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So I don't want to call him more than a streaming option, kind of similar to Caleb Williams, right? If you drafted Colston Loveland, you're probably looking to sit back and see what happens. Maybe you drafted another late round tight end, whatever it may be, right? And I think that Loveland is startable if you have nothing better, but once again, I don't want to call him more than a streaming option here in week 1. So startable, depends on who is on your roster. Let's kind of sit back and see what happens would be my call. And then Cole Kmet is just going to be a sit for me, but don't be shocked if Cole Kmet still has somewhat of a role in this system and with the Bears in the passing game. But I think that the upside certainly lies with Colston Loveland, but Kmet going to be a sit pretty easily for me in week 1. There you guys have it. Every single matchup, every single player at quarterback and tight end, and who you should be starting or sitting in week 1. Guys, do me a favor on the way out. Make sure you guys hit that like button. I want to see how many likes we can get on our first quarterback tight end sit video of the season. But more importantly, make sure you guys drop any fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. I'll be answering every single comment on this video. So whatever you guys need, start, sits, trades, waivers, roster reviews, whatever it is, any position, any format for week 1, drop them down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I can. And do me the biggest favor of all, be sure to subscribe on the way out. This is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you're into that, be sure to subscribe on the way out. And when the playlists pop up on the screen here, make sure you guys check out what videos we have for week 1. We are going to have every single video you could possibly need to dominate week 1 of the fantasy season. And we're going to have videos each and every week to make sure you guys dominate the entirety of the season. And I'm so excited to be here for you guys along for the ride for the 2025 fantasy football season. It's going to be an incredible year. We're going to absolutely dominate our league. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.